it's funny how these shows are like half staffing groups.
Mm-hmm.
You go to other shows and it's all or medical devices, or here it's so much.
Yeah.
Staffing is such an important part of the model.
Yeah, it is very true. Are you guys? You're going health at the end of this month?
I don't think we'll be there. I mean, okay. I might take some meetings. We don't have a booth or anything.
Okay, cool. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Hacked Day 2. We're excited to have you. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Nick Stark. I'm part of the Emergency Medicine Innovation Collaborative, along with Zaid and Niharika, working hard on our live stream in the back. And we are thrilled to have you here for Day 2. Yesterday, as you'll remember, we started off with an introduction and some tips and tricks. Again, urging our teams to get out onto the exhibit floor to get some feedback from people in real time. Today, we're really excited to welcome Tim Sweeney, the CEO of Inflamatics, to talk with us about his company. They are over at booth 1220, and they're also giving a talk tomorrow at noon. So we encourage you to swing by and check in with them. But without further ado, I'll pass it over to Tim.
Thank you very much, Nick. Very much appreciate it. And thanks to the Hacked community for allowing us to speak here a little bit. In talking to Zaid about what might be useful for the group, it sounded like maybe a little bit of intro to Inflamatics, but then also kind of what a physician founder journey can look like, as I know many of you are probably interested in, or maybe already have started your own startups coming out of this innovation work.
Too low volume.
So just quickly, I was in general surgery residency at Stanford,
I think it's okay.
And in my 5th year, I dropped out to found Inflamatics, and that was about 8 years ago. And so I will cover a little bit about what Inflamatics does, and then sort of talk to you about what that founder journey was like. In terms of disclosures, what I'll say about both the company and the journey is that hindsight is 50-50. Hindsight is 20/20. And we've been pretty lucky. I'll try not to promote Inflamatics, but I think it's worth at least covering why we do what we do. So first, Inflamatics is very focused on emergency room patients with suspected acute infections, suspected sepsis. This was something we saw obviously all the time in general surgery and that you deal with every day. Trying to improve the diagnosis of very hard to diagnose patients, whether it's the multiply comorbid patient or the one with the lactate of 1.5, or the elderly, or those with vague symptoms. And these patients present a big burden to the system, right? There's a lot of decisions that we need to make for patients with suspected acute infection, suspected sepsis. Not just, do I prescribe antibiotics? Yes, that's an important one, but also what other diagnostics? Does the patient deserve the bundle? Where are they going in dispo? And downstream of this, of course, are a lot of effects on both the healthcare system and the individual patient, their outcomes. And what we've done is created a new kind of diagnostic that's under review right now with the FDA. We hope for clearance around the end of the calendar year. And our diagnostic is a blood test that works by looking at the host immune response to infections. So the cartoon kind of illustrates that. Imagine, for instance, you had a patient with a pneumonia, and down in some air sac you have some bacteria. The patient doesn't come to the ER because of an infection per se, right? They come to the ER because of the systemic response to that infection, right? The fevers, the joint aches, the muscle pains, that's what they're showing up complaining of. And of course, what causes that is white blood cells coming out of circulation and fighting that infection. And it turns out that when the white blood cells re-enter the circulation, they carry with them these patterns of activation that we can read out in the blood to do things like detect the presence of infections, determine whether an infection is bacterial or viral, risk stratify somebody for how likely they are to need ICU level care. And we've developed all of this into a test system that we affectionately call Myrna, a play on words on myRNA or mRNA, because we look at mRNA panels. And Myrna runs in about 30 minutes and is very easy to use. And again, is under review with the agency right now and expect clearance at the end of the year. But you could imagine, a pretty simple blood test with a 30-minute turnaround time. And just to briefly say what the test does, to make clear, we actually are not a test for sepsis. There's lots of tests for sepsis. And I think the fundamental problem is that most patients don't have sepsis, right? You're maybe in this group, this sort of acute infection group, maybe the prevalence is 5%. An accurate test for sepsis. It's just going to say not sepsis 95% of the time, and then you're kind of stuck at square one. And so when I was in training, we always talked about sepsis as two things, right? You have to decide whether there's an infection on one axis and whether there's organ dysfunction on the other. And obviously, if you have both, that's kind of sepsis by whatever definition you want to use. But lots of people come in with a fever and they have, a mild pneumonia and they need antibiotics, but they can go home. And lots of people have a fever, but it turns out that they have, you know, a COPD flare or a PE or something else that's non-infectious in nature. And so what we've done with Triverity is created a test that produces 3 scores that tries to evaluate these patients. So 1 blood test, 3 separate scores. You get a bacterial score, a viral score, and an illness severity score. Now, the bacterial and viral scores are separate, so you could imagine a patient, for instance, high, co-infected, or critically sort of low, non-infected. And this illness severity score reads out as the likelihood to need ICU level care of any cause within 7 days. And so the 3 scores can sort of place patients on this grid, right? Patients with a bacterial or viral infection identified by those 2 scores, whereas you have this measure of illness severity down here. And so, for instance, a patient with sepsis might, you know, need broad spectrum antibiotics and go to the ICU if it's sort of, you know, high bacterial, high illness severity. But you could also get a, you know, low severity viral infection and send the patient right home. And just to say, we have completed a couple of pretty large studies. As you can see, about a 600 patient pilot multi-center study, and then a 1,200 patient study that is under review at the agency now across 22 sites. And I won't review the accuracy data. We think it's pretty good, but sort of the interesting headlines are around you know, potential reductions in inappropriate antibiotics, potential reductions in missed bacterial infections, which happens in the data more often than you might think, and even potential reductions in patients judged to be low risk who end up in the ICU anyway. And so as the test gains clearance and then goes live at different hospital systems, we certainly hope to take this from the realm of the hypothetical to actually improving outcomes. So that's a little about informatics and what we've been covering. I'm certainly happy to answer questions about that after the talk. I think that for this group, it might be interesting to cover a little bit sort of what was the stage to get from, gosh, this is a really good idea, to building a product and getting it submitted and almost to market. You know, when I started this, we got a lot of stuff about, you know, hey, you know, you don't have an MBA, you don't know anything about business, what are you doing founding something anyway? I think in retrospect, there's a lot of things that make physicians really good founders. And of course, there's the obvious ones about, like, you know, you know what you need, you know what your patients need, you know how hospitals work. Something that I've learned over time is physicians are also pretty good in terms of other things that are critical in startups, right? We know how to regulate ourselves during very tense times, very tough times. We know how to build effective teams, right? Medicine is a team sport, absolutely. And you work with a different team all the time, and a huge part of startups is building those teams. And we know how to make big decisions with not enough data, and you'll face that every single day in startup land. So first, just to say, if you're thinking about doing this, I encourage you to. It's very fun, and there's absolutely no reason physicians can't make excellent founders. Now, leaving medicine is very difficult, and I did. I left medicine in my 5th year of residency, and my license lapsed about a year later, and I haven't been back. And you sort of, you know, it can take different flavors. I at first was working on this part-time, and then eventually jumped full-time. And you know, part-time makes sense for a while until you can't do it part-time anymore. If you want real funding from an investor, you're probably going to need to go full-time. That's probably true for most folks. Some people can go back, right? There's lots of people who've sort of taken a year off, done a thing, and then left. But that's what it means, is you have to kind of leave that business behind and go back to medicine. Some specialties are different. EMED may be one that sort of tolerates a little bit of practice on the side. But at some point, if the business takes off, you sort of have to be willing to be there for it and grow with it. Is it worth it? For me, unequivocally, yes. It's been super fun. And I really recommend anybody to take the jump. I think I say this later as well, but it's just an incredible learning experience, and it's very rewarding. What I will say is I sought advice from literally dozens and dozens of mentors and other physicians. And I would say 99% of them say, do what I did. Those who stay in academics tell you to stay in academics. Those who leave tell you to leave. Those who go into private practice tell you to go to private practice. Rarely will you hear someone say, what do you want? And in the end, that's what it's all about. So a little about the journey itself. You know, I will say a lot of this is timing and luck, etc. I won't go into this too much, but sort of Informatics was founded kind of in the right place at the right time. You know, there was advents of big data. We were at Stanford in the bioinformatics department. NIH had funded a lot of work that we got to build off of. The background technology for measuring a lot of mRNAs from the blood in 30 minutes seemed kind of science fiction-y then, but maybe attainable. And certainly we'd seen the growth of a lot of other multiplex molecular platforms. Market incentives were growing. Sepsis was a big thing. We could sort of point to somebody would be wanting to buy this someday. And there was capital available. That's obviously key. We had come sort of a couple years after the Theranos debacle, but pre some of the big crashes in 2021. So there was sort of enough willingness to bet on diagnostics that we were able to get going. When you actually decide to do this, there's a huge amount to do, and I'm very happy to talk afterwards. But just remember, it sort of starts with deciding to do it, right? Great, we're gonna do a startup. We got to get going. And I'd say sort of item number 2 is crafting a pitch, right? You have to tell people what you want to do and why you deserve funding and time and energy. And then, of course, all the other things, finding a team and licensing the IP and incorporation and getting funding and everything else. Just to say every single one of those is probably a new challenge you won't have encountered before. And often the best place to encounter sort of advice for a lot of these things is in accelerators. I do recommend, if you're going to do it, at least join one. We ended up joining sort of 2 or 3, and that was kind of too many. But one of the key things an accelerator do is not necessarily give you didactic advice like this thing, like you can do without that. It'll give you another community of founders that can sort of say, yeah, here's what's on market now, and here's what we're doing, and that's very, very helpful early on. Of course, you're going to need funding. You should, especially early on, be thinking about both dilutive and non-dilutive funding. So grants, right? The key to getting grants funded is to write lots of grants. That's it. You have to just keep writing grants until they start to get accepted. We were rejected from, I want to say, every grant at Stanford intramurally, and some big grants externally, which is actually why we founded the business. I was hoping to do it kind of like as an academic thing, and they said no. And I said, gosh darn it, that's not going to work for me. I have to go look someone in the eye and tell them why this is such a good idea. And so that's when you start talking to investors. And investors are the same thing. You're going to need a lot of shots on goal. Most people will say no, especially early. Someone who shares your vision, it's a hard thing to find. But just remember, the clock starts, right? So grants it's a very low stress thing. You can do it part-time. They sort of go along. You're doing some research. Once you start to take investor money, that clock's there. They want to return at some point, and they're going to start to have a say about the business. Now, the other side of it is, your SBIR is $250,000, $1 million up front. Seed round can be 5, 6, 7 million, right? So it's a lot more available to you, and it can be rocket fuel. Just make sure you're ready for it. And always, 2 things I always tell people. One, you will get enormous amounts of advice about how to fundraise from people who have not done it. And my strong suggestion to you is to ignore all of it. Every lawyer or MBA you talk to that tells you they know what investors want, that hasn't done it themselves, feel free to ignore. And the other is that funding is not a goal, right? We always think about it. You see the big announcements. Funding is not a goal. It's a means to an end. And once you get that funding, you will feel the weight that you have gotten that funding and now have to deliver on that promise. And something just to keep in mind. In the end, what it's about is bending the world to your vision. And everyone will say no all the time. I knew I wanted to do this, and I knew this thing in big data, learning how transcriptomics could build better diagnostics. And I applied to the bioinformatics role at Stanford and was rejected. And so I had to apply again the next year. Our first major foundational paper in using transcriptomics was rejected from Science Translational Medicine, and we rejected the rejection. We just wrote responses and sent them in. Said no, thank you. We're going to go back under review, and they did. Our grants are always rejected. Most investors say no. Most partners sign. What you have to do is get to yes. That's your job, right? Your number one job is getting to yes, selling your vision, cheerleading your team and the outside world to why what you're doing is so important. And this is not just investors, it is everybody else that works on your company. Everybody needs to hear that vision all the time. And so what I will say is a big part of the founder journey is being ready to sell what you love. It's just a huge part of it. If you don't do it, no one will. In the end, if we've had success in informatics, it's because we've worked with great people. Of course, sort of way back in my career, whether it was working on sepsis mouse models at Duke, or sort of the wisdom of Tom Crummell at Stanford telling me to take an extra year of research, then all the way through to the founding team, to the people we have with us now, clinical trial sites, partners, etc. It's really important to work with people that you want to work with as you grow your vision. And finally, I'll just say this: as you consider whether or not to do a startup, to found a startup, it's really important to be honest with yourself about why you're doing it. You know, money and fame and success, those are all valid reasons. But if you're not clear with yourself on what your goal is, you'll make decisions in the wrong way. The journey is hard, and it will present a lot of things that you have no training in. And what I recommend is sort of taking steps back and going for a walk and doing your best. And I guess my closing thought is it's just enormously fun. You will learn a ton. If you stay humble, you know, you can sort of continue to push this dream of yours into reality. The highs are very high and the lows very low, but it's very, very enjoyable. So if you'd like to learn more about the test itself, about Triverity, which is, again, under review, we do have a booth, as mentioned, at 12:20, or I'm happy to talk afterwards. If you're doing your own thing, if you're doing your own startup and just kind of want to chat about what that's like or how to get funding or talk to investors or anything else, I'm very happy. I love to work with founders. My personal email's here. You can follow us on social media to follow the company and the updates. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Really appreciate it. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Tim. We have a little bit of time to open it up for questions. If anybody has questions for Tim, particularly as it pertains to kind of this pivot from medicine to medical devices, starting a company. Okay. Here, I'll bring you a mic.
What are the early days of you? Is this an idea you had that you needed to pursue other experts in the field? And then after that, you know, how did you get the business side of things, which we don't really get much training on as physicians, to launch a new company rather than just an idea? You know, science is one thing, but you know, getting the business aspect of it is the most intimidating part.
Yeah. So I'll repeat the question. You know, what was the sort of was it my idea? How did it all start? And then how do we get through all those steps? And maybe I'll go back to that. You know, sort of what are all the things, especially around actually just building a business. So this actually was in the end kind of my idea. There was a big NIH kind of grant, or maybe boondoggle, called the GLUE grant, where they studied sepsis and trauma with omics and sort of didn't produce much other than a description that sepsis causes a genomic storm. And I met some of those guys at a conference and I said, hey, why don't you use these data to try to like predict infections? And the group was on stage and they said, look, kid, the data are available, do it yourself. And I said, challenge accepted, and sort of had this burning desire. But you know, I certainly didn't plan to start a company out of it. I mean, the plan was to stay in academics and kind of do some research. And it wasn't until we had put a lot of the prelim data together that it was like, oh, maybe this thing ought to be a product. Like we can determine whether there's an infection and what type and how sick a patient is from one blood draw. That's something that should be out in the world. And so naturally, of course, we went and tried to license it instead of build a business, because it seemed scary to build a business. And retrospectively, the pitch was terrible. We went to big companies and we were like, if you build a technology you don't quite understand and a team that you don't have, then you can displace your own products on the market. And not surprisingly, they were like, yeah, no, thank you. So we decided to do it ourselves, and I left academics to found a business. So 100%, I knew nothing about things like you know, getting space or setting up HR or getting insurance. My co-founder, Jonathan, his background was, he actually was an MBA, and he had commercialized molecular diagnostics. And I do think that having you know, a team of founders is often the best way to go. I don't know that it necessarily has to be as lucky as we got in terms of finding someone who knows the business of the space and is willing to join you right up front. But you know, like Y Combinator talks a lot about the necessity to have a team to start, and somebody who's going to focus on, you know, nitty gritty things while you're out. Sort of, you know, someone's got to be down and in while you're sort of up and out. And I would also say, I think early on, what you'll find is people are pretty forgiving. You know, someone who's leaving their job to join you and your buddy at this business is doing it because they kind of want to do something exciting and new. And so you'll find that there's a lot of flexibility early on. And frankly, that's exactly what you want. If you have somebody that rigidly demands to be on a group insurance plan, that is not employee number one at your startup, let me tell you. So I don't know, hope that answered the question.
Fantastic question. And I think, Tim, that speaks really well to something we talked about yesterday within our teams. leveraging each other's strengths. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Inflamatics, for your support of Hacked, and we're excited to send folks over to your booth. Again, you have that talk tomorrow at noon.
Yep.
And thank you again so much.
See us at 12:20. Thank you all so much for your time. Appreciate it.